So I'm just going to hand out some postcards. So feel free, or just pass them around. Feel free to take one or two. There's a bunch of different kinds, and I will explain what those are about in the course of this. So my paper is about two art projects that I've completed, and one I'll be doing based on the first two, all of which intersect with the practice of doing history in some way. So I'm actually relatively new to history. My background is in anthropology, which has its own interesting links to art, and I'm now in the Canadian Studies PhD at Trent. But even before I started the PhD, I became fascinated with the way in which history is done in the university, but also how it's understood and mobilized outside of the university in the community. So I'm interested specifically, and this is because this also came up in my research in anthro, in how the myth of objectivity persists, or so I would argue, even when apparently the majority of academics no longer believe it to be the case. So with these history/art projects that I did, I basically wanted to ask the question, what is making this possible? What conditions are making it possible for this understanding of history as objective record to persist in certain communities? So I, in essence, designed a couple of art projects to do some tests. A social scientist that I am, I guess. So at the time of the projects, I also was not actually a student, but was working at ArtSpace, which is an artist-run center in Peterborough, which is first and foremost a gallery. So this, of course, fueled the direction that these projects took. As I wasn't immersed in the academic history world at the time as I am now, but in the art world, which has very different priorities and influences. So the most overt influence on the first project I completed, and I'll explain them all in sequence, was a 2008 poster project by a Vancouver-based artist, Michael Drobert, which he called Available Light. So the poster, which he put up around Vancouver, was all about potentiality. So it's the potential of this action to take place, underscored by its ambiguity and the lack of any concrete location or time. So as the exhibition stated, quote, "Available light functions as a catalyst, one that has positive as well as potentially dangerous aspects. As the exact location, time, and scope of the fire the artist will attempt to produce will be unknown, the gesture takes on both a romantic and saboteur-like feel, rife with associations. The potential destruction in Drobert's gesture is as strong as the potential of hope," end quote. So I actually ended up staring at a reproduction of this poster quite frequently as it was taped on the wall above the toilet at ArtSpace. So the idea took place in my mind of doing something similar in Peterborough, which is, I think, a city full of unrealized potential. So the second main influence on my first project was the documentary film My Winnipeg by Canadian filmmaker Guy Maddin, which is an excellent film, and I really encourage you to check it out. I think it's on Netflix. He describes the film as a docu-fantasia, which is, according to him, a curious blend of fact and fiction, weaving together stories and memories of his childhood with the history of the city. So I think that the film creates doubt in the viewer's mind about what's true and what isn't, but through this also attempts to get at some other kind of truth. This is perhaps what the filmmaker Werner Herzog calls ecstatic truth. Herzog says that fact creates norms and truth illumination. He differentiates between the two, saying facts are for accountants, and that truth can only be achieved through fabrication, imagination, and stylization. I think that the Canadian novelist Michael Winter similarly describes this process as making up sets of facts that convey the truth of things. So the Available Light poster in Maddin's film My Winnipeg gave me a model on which to build. The concrete medium in the form of the poster, using a blend of so-called fact and fiction, basically as different as it could get from the historical plaques that you often find throughout, especially small towns. So I created what I called simply History Project, a series of 8 posters that I put up around Peterborough in a variety of locations, some conventional, some quite odd, during the summer of 2014. And it's these posters that are also part of the project down the hall. So most of these posters were actually taken down almost immediately, as far as I can tell. Some were washed away in a rainstorm that claimed the first batch several hours after I put them up. I should have checked the weather better. But many of them stayed up for weeks, and I even came across some social media posts. So the one on the right is actually in the Trent University paper that's published, and I have a couple other here with media posts as well. But because they are anonymous, it was really hard to track their movements. and everything I heard about them afterwards was usually through word of mouth. So the main question I heard about them naturally was, are they true? But by the end of the project, I found this question kind of irrelevant, as it was never necessarily my purpose to portray a 100% factually true story, whatever that would even entail depending on people's definitions. I would say that the stories are all based on historical fact, or at least inspired by it, with some kind of imaginative modification, although a couple of them I would also say are pretty well verbatim. In essence, I would say that they all could be true. So I made the poster specifically to straddle that divide and essentially create doubt in the reader, both about the story itself, but also about the conventions of historical writing and the authority of the practice. So the second project I did builds on these posters. It was done as part of Arts Week, which is it's a city-funded annual arts festival in Peterborough. I worked with another artist, Andrea Catellis, to make a historical walking tour with some twists. But essentially, we made use of the format of walking tours like the ones that I assume took place last night. And that's what the postcards are. They are all examples of some of the stops along the tour. And you'll notice that there are people's addresses on the back. I meant to mail those out, but I got really sidetracked. So I invite you to mail them if you want to and become a part of this process. It would be excellent. So we used the conventions of the walking tour, but subverted them in certain ways. The map that we produced had numbers corresponding to all the locations in town, but all the descriptions of the stops were riddles, forcing the walking tourists to decipher them in order to figure out what they were actually meant to be looking at. And most of the time, nothing actually remained to look at, because like with the poster project, most of the artifacts disappeared hours after we put them there. And in truth, some of them actually looked like garbage that was just strewn along the road. So even if they remained, people probably wouldn't necessarily have realized that's what the stop was. But they are meant to be ephemeral and impermanent, and so they often just disappeared. But similarly, the project was meant to interrogate the value of history and what I would call the service of community enrichment in some way, and to draw attention to these conventions of historical writing and deployment in the community. And what's particularly interesting about this iteration of the project, I think, was the jury process. So the project was submitted to Arts Week, which then weighted against other projects because it's first and foremost an art show, an exhibition. We actually got some funding to make this, which I find really funny. But there was apparently some debate about the project by the jury itself. And I know this because Peterborough is a really small place with no secrets. So I found out that one of the jury members, who apparently is a Parks Canada employee, was vehemently opposed to this project. The person thought that it was dishonest and liable to cause harm to those attempting to understand it and just have a good time during the week taking the tour. And I should say that Arts Week is not necessarily known for its history of really good critical work. Like any municipally funded project, or at least arts project, there are certain parameters that have to usually be met, which is mainly that it's accessible, family-friendly, and inoffensive. Nevertheless, we got money. And I think that's mostly due to the advocacy of another member of the jury who actually had a PhD in history and thought that it was an interesting experiment, all of which seems really ironic to me in some way. So the third project I'll mention has yet to be produced, but we'll build on these last two, mostly because I haven't gotten any money for that one yet. And it's interesting to also be presenting on that when I haven't made it, because that's kind of odd, but at the same time feels somewhat appropriate given the nature of these other projects. For the project, I essentially plan to make a podcast based on these stories and posters in the style of them, and inspired by the format of Welcome to Night Vale, which is a popular podcast in the style of community updates for this fictional small desert town in the States. And the updates are generally bizarre and supernatural in nature. And as they describe it, the podcast features, quote, local weather, news, announcements from the sheriff's secret police, mysterious lights in the night sky, dark hooded figures with unknowable powers, and cultural events, end quote. So the podcast will feature a voiceover telling the history of Peterborough, of its people, its institutions, notable events and buildings, but all in the way in which I did these history posters in the walking tour. So it'll be a mix of voice and archival audio material I find, which may or may not be from Peterborough, but with the intention, again, of creating doubt in the listener, of unsettling this boundary between fact and fiction, if it really exists, and just trying to get at some kind of other truth or illumination, which at the end of the day, for me, I think is something that better reflects really the weirdness of everyday life and history, and that's especially true in Peterborough, if you've ever been there. So with these projects, my intention has been to explore the conventions of history, of actually doing it and what its effects are in the community. But to be honest, I don't necessarily know what those effects are, and this is largely a result of the nature of the projects. They were designed to be totally anonymous and ephemeral, and so they're really hard to track. And I didn't, for some reason, well, I had a sense of that before I did it, but I didn't realize how difficult that would be, I guess. But I do have some indications of the effects that they had. So most of the people I talked to knew that they weren't necessarily entirely true, but never knew for sure exactly what part of the story were untrue. So the posters on the tour, I think at the end, created the doubt that I was going for, which I was quite happy about. However, others I talked to did take them as literal truth, and there are quite a few people I talked to who thought that they were totally verbatim from the archives or something. They couldn't discern any falsehood in them, and I actually talked to people who started to pass those stories on to others as part of just the general Peterborough lore, which I was super psyched about as well. But it's that reaction in particular that I think reinforced my questions about objectivity and historical authority. So considering the format of the posters I used, I literally wrote them with a Sharpie and then just photocopied them, and then put them up around town anonymously. I wondered what it was about that format that made people actually believe them, because it's so different from the historical plaque one. I purposely used this format that I thought in some ways was fundamentally opposed to that historical plaque, because they're usually, these plaques are sanctioned by the government, by the municipality, and are backed up by historians with authority in some way. Yet even so, some people believe my posters anyway. And to be honest, one of my main motivations coming from the art world for this was mischief. Of playing around with these stories to make local history more interesting and dynamic. And I don't think it wasn't malicious in any way, I just wanted to make them more interesting. But I didn't necessarily think that anyone would really believe them. I just wanted that doubt there. So the kind of the general framework that I've been working with for this, that came after doing the project actually, I think is best provided by Emily Cameron in her recent book, Far Off Metal River, which is about the legacy of the so-called Bloody Falls Massacre in 1771 in the Arctic, and how it's become a kind of settler shorthand for the beginning of history in Canada. And that's the quote for her. So in the book, she defines storytelling as a relational and material ordering practice. So stories are not necessarily ephemeral after all. They're not just words used to convey a feeling or some kind of inferior oral tradition, but rather have real material effects on our lives. So my projects try to make sense of this by attempting to provoke a response that demonstrates this material effect by interrogating in whatever small way the conventions of historical writing and dissemination. They were essentially meant to intervene in people's lives, to bring history into their daily activities and make them think about the place in which they live. So like the Available Light posters earlier, I was trying to make mine a catalyst for something, whatever that happened to be. And my favorite feedback about the projects was from someone who told me that after reading the posters and trying out the tour, they simply thought that the projects conveyed a sense of Peterborough as a city that has been lived in. A city that in fact has a history, which I think was interpreted by this person differently than would have been in a typical academic sense. I also think that some people, for example that Parks Canada employee, have thought that I was playing fast and loose with history, in exaggerating and reimagining some of these stories and histories. But I think that it's first disingenuous to assume that we can tell history objectively, and that's come up again in this conference over and over, that archives provide some kind of taken for granted reading of past events. It's all a process of selection and interpretation. And I think that history needs to always expand outward and take on these linkages with other disciplines or ways of doing things, especially with art, even though that might not seem like the natural connection at first. And so maybe the call for this kind of reflexivity and the relevance of the discipline is a tired refrain, but at the same time, if I've learned nothing else from my background in Anthro, all of these things are performances. Culture needs to be done again and again, and these performances need to be reinscribed again and again or have relevance. And so I'm hoping with these projects and a little twist on them that I try out, I'm successful at doing this project in some small way, and at the very least, I just wanted to get people on the street to stop for a second and wonder at why the poster they're reading seems so weird. And then perhaps that will drive them to reflect on what history means to them and why it matters to them at that time and place in their lives. Thank you.